أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Reflections on the Risale-i Nur by Bediuzzaman Said Nursi podcast series. This is Mustafa Tuna. You can listen to the episodes of this series wherever you get your podcasts or at the website, as you can see for those who are watching this on the screen, at the website www.reflections-rn.org. Inshallah, as those who listened to this episode last week will remember, we are now recording the podcasts on video and posting them on YouTube as well. And you can access the YouTube video from the same website, www.reflections-rn.org. In the previous episode last week, we took a look at Bediuzzaman Said Nursi's life. Of course, we had done this way before, about 3.5 years ago, when this podcast first started. But since we are now doing the video version, I wanted to go back and take another look at that. And I am actually doing an extended version of the biography of Bediuzzaman Said Nursi. So as we tried to answer the question of who Bediuzzaman Said Nursi is, we began with his childhood and we took a quick look at his education. We learned that amazingly at around his mid-teens, around age 15, he had taken his ijaza, his certificate of scholarship. He was certified to teach and also to speak on behalf of the tradition of Islam. As a scholar of Islam, he had become an alim in that young age, mashallah. He had 2 ijazas, and both of these ijazas went to extended to Ali radiallahu anh through Imam Ghazali, mashallah. So that's where we started, and inshallah in this episode we will continue from where we left. So we mentioned that having received his ijazah, Ustad Nursi begins traveling around the various towns, cities, villages in the vicinity of his hometown, the village of Nurs in the town of Bitlis, in the Kurdish inhabited territories to the southeast of Anatolia, which was known as Kurdistan at the time. And after teaching and preaching in various Kurdish provinces for about a year, in 1897, he accepts an invitation from the governor of the city of Van and moves there. Now, as we mentioned, his photographic memory, sharp intellect, deep ikhlas, sincerity attracts the attention of everybody in this region. So very quickly he becomes famous and he comes to be known as Bediuzzaman, the marvel of the time. So the governor of Van, the city of Van, also hears this and invites him to come to Van and teach there. Also, the governor of Van, in a sense, becomes Bediuzzaman Said Nursi's patron. Now that governor will change, after a short while, but the new governor who replaces the old one also likes Bediuzzaman a lot and hosts him in his mansion and gives him lots of opportunities in order to research, study, and teach. So he stays in this less provincial city. Van is less provincial than the areas that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi had been traveling through for about 10 years. So 1897 to 1907, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi will be in the city of Van. Meanwhile, he also explores modern scientific and political literature in the governor's evidently large library. Now, this governor is an Ottoman educated official, which means that he attended the westernized institutions of education in the empire. He had preserved his religiosity, so he was a pious person, and that's why he takes an interest in Bediuzzaman Said Nursi and supports him, through and through. But at the same time, he most likely spoke French, and he was an intellectual. He subscribed to magazines. He ordered books in translation and probably in original publications in French, etc. So he had a large library where he had not only texts printed in the Ottoman Empire, but imported texts, which must have given access to Bediuzzaman Said Nursi to the scientific literature and the philosophical literature of the time. Now that library burnt, that mansion was burnt and in a fire, and the library is lost. So we do not know exactly what was in the library, but we know that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi here studies geography, astronomy, algebra, mathematics, to an extent that he has enough knowledge in all of these fields to be able to engage in scholarly debates with the experts of these fields, experts at the level of high school teachers. So the governor also enjoyed, watching Bediuzzaman Said Nursi engage in debates with other people and out-debate them. So he would invite to his mansion high school teachers, maybe medical doctors, veterinarians, whoever was around among the intellectuals of the city, and then open up topics and have Bediuzzaman Said Nursi discuss with these individuals. So recognizing the challenge, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi takes an interest in the governor's library and goes through it the way he went through all other texts with his photographic memory, mashallah. We do not know if he learned French. It's quite likely that he may have learned French and read texts in French too, because he was so intelligent. He could learn languages very easily. And later on in his life, when he becomes a member of the House of Wisdom of Islam, the Dar al-Hikmatul Islamiyya, after World War I in Istanbul, as he was becoming a member, as he was being appointed to that institute, he passes a test for French. So at some point he learned some French, and he may have read the material there too, but whether he read in French or not, there was enough material in translation. So he learns what we can call the positive sciences of the time too. So as it writes there, because this library perished in a fire, we do not know exactly what he read, what he studied. However, it appears that he had mastered advanced works in several disciplines of knowledge, from physiology. Yeah, that's interesting, because he writes a treatise in physiology that's lost, along with another treatise he wrote on algebra, and those are both lost in that fire. And geography, to philosophy and algebra, to the extent that he would be tested by the experts of those disciplines at the governor's manor and consistently come out undefeated. So, mashallah, we know that he had become an accomplished scholar in the sciences of Islam. Tafsir, usul tafsir, fiqh, usul fiqh, hadith, Arabic language, balagha, which is like the eloquence, grammar, logic, so on and so forth. He had become an expert in all of these, and now he is becoming an expert in the positive sciences of the time too. So he has two wings. He is a scholar with two wings, and he can move with those two wings, mashallah. Now, in 1907, Ustad Nursi travels to Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, primarily to seek financial and political support to open a madrasa that would teach religious and positive sciences together simultaneously in Turkish, Kurdish, and Arabic in the empire's eastern lands. Now, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi is born in Kurdistan. He is a child of this region, and he has enormous concern for the ummah, all people, the ummah, and the people, his local community. He wants to serve. He wants to do something for them. And he recognizes that the existing systems of education that are in place, the existing institutions that preserve knowledge, religion, religiosity, ethics, morals, they are falling short. There are these positive sciences, and there are some schools that teach the positive sciences, but those schools exist in such a paradigm that those who attend these schools become irreligious, or and they don't become atheists. They still perhaps remain Muslim, but they lose their respect for religion. The paradigm changes. The authority of religion in their minds is replaced by the authority of rational thinking, or experimentation and observation, the positive sciences. And even when they are religious, they want to verify the veracity of religion with positive sciences. So there's a shift that's happening. And on the other hand, there are the madrasas that are continuing to teach with the methods that they had been teaching for centuries, but they are falling behind. They are becoming disconnected with the changes that are happening in the world. And Bediuzzaman Said Nursi has two wings. He wants other people to have two wings too. So he thinks of an institution, a system of madrasas, actually not one madrasa, but a system of madrasas, a few madrasas in critical locations, well-chosen strategic locations in the region. And he also is seeing that the people of the region speak Kurdish. The governors, officials, officers speak Turkish, and there's a disconnect there too, right? And then the language of scholarship in Islam, of course, is Arabic. So he wants to have a system of madrasas. He will call them Madrasatu Zahra. He wants to have a system of madrasas where he can teach both the religious sciences and the positive sciences, and also do so in three languages: Turkish, Kurdish, and Arabic, mashallah. But this is a big initiative, and he needs support for that initiative. This is not something that he can do as an individual with the small resources that can possibly procure in the region. It is something that will serve the society broadly, and he wants the government to finance this. To have the government finance this, he needs to go to Istanbul and ask for money from the palace. The governor of one also likes the idea and supports him, so he writes a letter for him, and having that letter of recommendation, Said Nursi, or Bediuzzaman Said, or Mullah Said, as he was called at this time, goes to Istanbul. It is late 1907 when he sets out. He probably arrives end of December or the beginning of 1908. Now, this is an interesting time in the Ottoman Empire, as let's read first from here. A few months after his arrival in Istanbul, Ustad Nursi finds himself in the thick of revolutionary developments that transformed the Sultanate into a constitutional monarchy. So the Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, becomes a constitutional monarchy shortly after Bediuzzaman Said Nursi arrives in Istanbul. How does this happen? We have the Young Turks, these young men who graduated from westernized institutions of education in the empire, for whom that the balance of that authority between reason and revelation shifted. Reason comes first. Many of them became atheists too. And it is not only Muslims, there are non-Muslims among them too, especially early on. They will be eliminated in time, right? But this is the young intellectuals of the empire, and many of them are officers in the military. Now, because they're officers in the military, they have access to power. And in 1908, they organize a coup, and they force the Sultan, Abdulhamid II, to sign a constitution which then turns the regime of the empire into a constitutional monarchy. Now, this had happened before when Abdulhamid II came to power, but using the Russo-Ottoman War as an excuse and not having patience for the intricacies of a constitutional monarchy at the time, this is something new, really. Abdulhamid II abolishes the constitution, and along with that abolishes the parliament that the constitution entailed in 1870. He does this in 1878, shortly after he comes to power as a sultan. So 1908, 30 years after, the Young Turks push their way and introduce a constitution, introduce a parliament. The Ottoman Empire turns into a constitutional monarchy. Now, Abdulhamid II was trying to preserve the Ottoman Empire. This was a very hard time for the empire, for all Muslim states around the world, for all non-European / non-North American countries in the world. This was a time of European ascendancy, European domination. The Ottoman Empire was in the process of being carved out by the powers out there, including especially Russia, Austria-Hungary, and then Britain in parts of the empire that are further from the center, like Egypt, in North Africa by the French. So it was a very hard, very difficult time, and Abdulhamid II was trying to hold the empire together, and his methods were quite arbitrary and quite dictatorial. So there was a pushback against this dictatorial regime that Abdulhamid II had established. And Bediuzzaman Said Nursi took his share from that dictatorial centralized system. When he went to Istanbul, he was not welcomed there by the palace. He actually was not given access to the Sultan. At some point, he was actually put in a mental asylum, then in jail. So he wants to show himself here. He wants to make sure that this young man who came from the eastern lands of the empire, which are perceived to be backwards, is not backwards. He has enough knowledge to vie with the intellectuals and scholars of Istanbul, the top intellectuals and top scholars of the empire. So he does daring things, and some of these daring things are misunderstood, and including going to the palace and speaking in a daring way with the officers there. So he's first put in a mental asylum, then in jail, then put in jail, then mental asylum, then eventually released. Around that time, the Young Turk Revolution takes place. The country turns into a constitutional monarchy. So Bediuzzaman Said Nursi had a liberal attitude. And when I use the word liberal, I don't use it in the modern sense, modern North Atlantic sense of the word. I don't mean that he was economically liberal, right? Laissez-faire, laissez-passer, let them do, let them pass. He was not a liberal in a social sense. In a social sense, of course, he was conservative. He's a religious scholar. But he is politically liberal. He is for the idea of representation, the wishes, ideas, concerns of the larger population being taken into consideration in the process of government. He is for the absence of oppression and the establishment of justice. Right? So he was liberal in this sense, and throughout his life, he maintains this attitude. In 1908, this was articulated, or this manifest as constitutional monarchy, so he supports constitutional monarchy. Later on, when the republic was instituted in the lands of the Ottoman Empire as a Turkish republic, before the abolishment of the caliphate and so on and so forth, before the kinds of nonsense that the early ruling elite of the country introduces in Turkey, he supports the republic. He considers himself a republican person. He is always for freedom. The idea of freedom is like one of his core values. And in the 1950s, when democracy was introduced and pronounced more prominently in the country, he supports democracy, right? So this is his principled attitude. He is for freedom, right? Political freedom. I'm not talking about individual freedom. I'm not talking about freedom from the constraints of the Sharia and so on and so forth. When the constitutional monarchy was declared, that in Turkish is meşrutiyet, right? So meşrutiyet means conditional, right? There will be a constitution, and the powers of the government will be limited by the conditions of the constitution. This is the idea. And he says, this is very good, but meşrutiyet should be meşru'. Meşrutiyet meşru'a, i.e. these conditions should be determined by the Sharia, right? So he is not liberal, he is not for freedom in the sense of being cut off from the constraints of Sharia, right? What God has ordained, but rather he is for freedom in the sense of human beings not oppressing human beings not establishing themselves as dictators over human beings. So he supports the constitutional monarchy in this sense, before many of the problems that the Young Turk rule will becomes manifest, right, early on. He puts his knowledge and oratory skills in the service of the expanding freedoms in the empire in this period. Though importantly, he would insist that those freedoms should be exercised within the bounds of the Sharia. Right? Yet the initial euphoria of the revolution soon leaves its place to a chaotic struggle for power in the empire. So it doesn't end there. Abdulhamid II was, yes, had some oppressive means, was ruling with a heavy hand. You can consider him a dictator, an authoritarian person, but at the same time he had established the balances so well between various powers that were trying to destroy the Ottoman Empire, so balancing Russia with Austria-Hungary, so on and so forth, and various powers within the empire. He had balanced these out so well that he was able to preserve the empire despite all the odds, despite the fact that all the cards were decked against the empire. When his wisdom is taken out and when his methods are taken out, the empire falls into total chaos, and the Young Turks who come to power at this time start to fight among themselves too. There are factions that existed in the broader cohort of Young Turks, and those factions now start to make an imprint on how the country is being ruled. So seeing this chaos taking over, and also seeing that the Young Turks are not implementing the Sharia, and at some point he actually ends up being court-martialed and tried by the Young Turks. There was a rebellion against Young Turk rule in 1909. He never supports rebellion, right? He never supported a popular rebellion in his life. He did not like the idea of Muslims fighting Muslims, Muslim rebels fighting Muslim soldiers. He did not like the idea of the sword being unsheathed within the domain of Islam. He did not like the idea of war in general, but of course, if war was necessary to defend the lands of Islam, he was there, and he showed that he would be there in this case. But and he actually tries to calm people down during that rebellion, 1909. But regardless, he was considered a suspect and was tried, and he, comes out of the trial being exonerated. But the the initial euphoria, the initial optimism gradually leaves its place to, all this chaos. And he also, in the meanwhile, he also secures some money to establish his Madrasatul Zahra, this educational institution that he wanted to introduce in Kurdistan. So in 1912, he returns to the city of Van, having secured some finance for the madrasa, and actually lays out a foundation. Now, there's some controversy about this that I will briefly mention. Some people have suggested that he had received upwards of 12,000 liras from the state at this time, and he got that money and used that money throughout the rest of his life. He survived with that money. That is not correct. That is not how the government functioned. They would not give 12,000 liras to anybody. Put this in your pocket and go build a madrasa in the city of Van. 12,000 liras were earmarked for his project, and about 1,000 of that was sent to the governor's office in the city of Van to be used for the madrasa that he wanted to build. And the governor allocated him some land, and the foundations of this madrasa was laid. And in the meanwhile, he also started to teach in the city of Van. He had students. He began his madrasa without the building and the system, but he began teaching students. But the advent of World War I will prevent him from being able to complete this project, the Madrasatul Zahra. 1914, World War I begins. And Ustad Nursi, being a man of the times that he lived in, and always standing up to the challenge, puts that project on the side, Madrasatul Zahra, the madrasa project on the side, and with about, we don't know exactly how many, but probably upwards of 200 students that he had been teaching at the time, using that as a core, and gathering volunteers from the tribes of the region, he establishes a regiment of voluntary soldiers, a militia unit, to defend the region against the Russian armies that from the beginning of the war will advance. So at the beginning of the war, we have this battle in the Caucasus, Sarıkamış. The Ottoman forces unfortunately lose badly there. They did not have the logistical resources that they needed to fight in the cold climate of the mountains of the region, and many of them die freezing, unfortunately. So, and from there on, the Russians start to advance into Ottoman lands. They're occupying Ottoman lands, and Ustad Nursi puts together this voluntary regiment. Of course, he's not acting on his own. He's doing this in consultation with the government, and starts to defend the lands of Islam against the advancing Russian soldiers, Russian armies. Now, this is a really, really interesting period. Bediuzzaman Said Nursi is commanding about 1,000 or so soldiers, commanding a militia unit. And these are all really brave soldiers. The unit, makes a name for itself. Wherever there is a really difficult task, they are being sent there as a hit unit. So they are moving from place to place. The fighting is going on. But at the same time, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi, subhanallah, begins writing a commentary, a Quranic commentary. Now, he actually begins, the thought of writing this commentary is before the time of the war, but he starts to write a more like clean copy during the war. And the idea is that he thinks the Qur'an being the Qur'an reflecting all the divine names and the most tremendous level of all the divine names, covers everything. And of course, this is, supported by the verses, by the broader understanding of the tradition. There's nothing dry or wet that is not in the Quran, right? So this is endorsed by the Quran itself. Everything is in the Quran. It was Umar radiallahu anh, if I'm not mistaken, who would say that if he lost his the bridle of his camel, right, he would look for it in the Quran. Everything is in the Quran, provided that we know how to look for it. So if everything is in the Quran, and no single individual can, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam aside, no single individual can comprehend all of what is in the Quran, right? He thought that there has to be a commission with experts in various fields who should come together and study the Quran and write a commentary. But of course, this is not something that materializes. It has still not materialized in the way that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi thought it should materialize. And that not materializing, he wants to start writing this commentary himself, not from all perspectives, not from all fields of study that could be utilized in writing a commentary on the Quran, but especially focusing on the eloquence of the Quran. So he starts writing a commentary. The interesting thing is, much of what he wrote at the time, and he was able to comment on the first chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha, and the first 33 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran. And all put together, it is a volume, moderate-sized volume. He writes or authors much of this as he is commanding his army. In many cases, on horseback. He has one of his students riding with him, and whenever possible, stopping, the bullets are flying around, whenever possible, stopping and dictating to his student, right, and then he says, and the student writes. And it's an amazing commentary. And it shows the ikhlas, the sincerity of purpose that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi had with regard to the Quran at this time, because even the bullets flying around cannot distract him from his focused attention on the Quran. So he hoped that this would be the first volume, and he would continue and finish this commentary, which he had planned to be around 60 or 70 volumes all put together. That commentary remains as a manuscript early on, and as we will see later, later he is going to receive some support from the government and print what was authored during this really chaotic time in one volume. And later on, that volume became a part of Bediuzzaman Said Nursi's larger compendium of works, the Risale-i Nur collection, the Epistles of Light collection. It is one of the books in the Epistles of Light. However, he never was able to continue past the 33rd verse of this first chapter of the Quran and finish this commentary, this exegesis, in the way that he wanted to finish. But he says that the Risale-i Nur in its place became an accessible commentary on the Quran, perhaps the gist of what he would have put there in that exegesis. Okay, of course, painful end comes with the advance of the Russians. And while defending the city of Van against advancing Russian forces, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi eventually was wounded from one of his legs. His leg is broken, and he falls a prisoner of war to the advancing Russian forces. Now, that last battle actually was very important and useful, in the sense that the local population of the city of Van was able to escape the advancing Russian forces, partly because the Armenian forces that were part of the Russian army in the places that they went would torture and oppress the population quite a bit. So that last battle that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi and his militia unit fought helped the local population of Van to escape very likely torture and oppression. But he fell a prisoner of war, and he was taken to the city called Kostroma in northern Volga-Ural region, the border of Siberia, northern parts of the empire. If you imagine the Volga River that flows into the Caspian Sea, and follow that all the way to the end, to the city of Kazan in the north, where it makes a leftward bend, right? If you would need to go a bit more. The city of Kostroma is there. So he was taken to that city with several other Ottoman soldiers and officers, and he will spend close to 2 years as a prisoner of war in that city. Most Ottoman prisoners were stationed in a prison that was turned from a vodka factory into a prison, but the local Tatar population, now there are lots of Muslims living in that area, and they are primarily Tatars. The local Tatar Muslims noticed this precious scholar, and they vouch for him, and they take him out of the prison, and they have him stay in a small mosque in the city of Kostroma. And that small mosque, as we will see, becomes a really important location in Bediuzzaman Said Nursi's life. The isolation that he has there, in a sense, serves as chile or halwa, that the Sufis, when they travel on their spiritual path, from time to time they withdraw into this isolation. It's called chile or halwa. It's usually 40 days, and they dedicate their entire time and energy and thought to contemplation and to God. So this little mosque serves as a place of halwa for Bediuzzaman Said Nursi, and it was the location of, in a sense, a location for his transition from his earlier life, the active, sharp, daring scholar and also activist, right? Commander, right? From that earlier life to a more contemplative and gentler person that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi comes to call as the new Said. So for the period before this halwa in Kostroma, and it's not going to end there. That's a process, a process that continues for a few years. But it starts there. From this process, the period of, you can call it a spiritual surge, a spiritual crisis, and many giants of the Islamic tradition have a period like this in their lives. Imam Ghazali, as famously known, was a professor, a mudarris, or the head mudarris of the madrasa of Nizamiya, and at some point he comes to a point where he's like so constricted spiritually that he cannot teach any longer. He leaves everything and travels. Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi has a period like this in his life. Abdul Qadir Jilani or Gailani has a period like this in his life. So this is a pattern that we observe in the Ummah, in the giants of the Ummah. So he goes through a period of spiritual search, spiritual crisis. If you will, he goes through a suluk, wayfaring, at the end of which he will come out as a new person, and he calls that new person New Said. But this Kostroma, period of imprisonment in Kostroma, is so important because this is the beginning of it. This is where things, if you will, are triggered. But there will be more, of course, to the process, and we will talk about that, inshallah. So, approximately 2 lonely years of introspection in this northern city of Kostroma marks the beginning of a spiritual crisis. Maybe we should call it spiritual search, spiritual wayfaring that lasts more than a decade for Ustad Nursi. So it was not overnight, it was a process. Meanwhile, the war is continuing. The Ottoman Empire is unfortunately losing. At the beginning, at the Battle of Gallipoli, for instance, it looks like they could come out victorious from this war. But as the war turns into a war of attrition, it becomes a matter of not only the bravery of the soldiers and the fighting power of the existing army, but also, and more importantly so, a function of the ability of the state, the country, to sustain the war effort. So that comes down to economy. And the Ottoman Empire, of course, entered the war as an ally of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. But the engine of this alliance was Germany, and Germany had a lot of industry, a really burgeoning, booming economy, but it was constrained to Europe. The Allied powers, Britain, France, later on Italy, later on America, they had access to the seas. They were able to mobilize more resources. So when things turned into a war of attrition by the end of 1917 or so, and Russia, of course, is also with Britain and France, by the end of 1917 or so, it becomes relatively clear that the Central Powers are not going to do well at the end of this. However, Russia was not doing well either, because its economy was not on par with the economy of Germany or England or France. And as the war extends, it will start to lose its ability to sustain the war. Britain attempted to support it logistically. That's one of the main reasons why they opened the Battle of Gallipoli to the south of the Marmara Sea, at the straits between the Marmara Sea and the Aegean or Mediterranean seas. But the Ottomans were able to stop them there, and once they could not cross the Gallipoli, they could not reach Istanbul, they could not cross the Bosphorus, they could not provide logistical support to Russia through the Black Sea. Plus, Russia was a huge country, and it was not easy for Britain, even if they had access. It was not easy for them to, provide all the logistical support that Russia Russia needed in order to sustain the war effort. So the Russian economy collapses. That leads to a revolution in Russia. The Bolsheviks take over. The regime completely collapses, and chaos follows the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917, and taking advantage of this chaos, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi escapes from Kostroma, and that's a really interesting story too, but I don't want to go into too much detail about these stories. We are trying to do a broad survey of his life. So he escapes from Kostroma and through Central Europe. We know that he had been to Austria, through Bulgaria. He comes back to Istanbul. So he escapes from imprisonment during Russia's chaotic state in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of 1917. He travels to Istanbul through Europe, and upon his arrival, he was welcomed as a war hero. And in recognition of his scholarly aptitude, he was appointed as a member of the empire's recently founded highest council of Islamic scholarship, called Darul Hikmet al-Islamiyya, the House of the Wisdom of Islam. Now, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi was famous before he went back to want to found his madrasa. He was famous in Istanbul. He was famous across the empire. So he was known. But he became more famous when the stories of his heroism and the stories of the heroism of his militia unit, and that he fell a POW to Russians, became widespread. So when he comes back to Istanbul, he is really welcome, like a hero. He is appointed a member of this institute. He has a good salary. One of his nephews comes and starts to stay with him. So his nephew is, helping him, serving him, helping him in the household, acting like a secretary. Whenever he wants to write something, he can dictate to this nephew, he also becomes a student of Bediuzzaman Said Nursi. He rents a house in Çamlıca, which is one of the nicest places in Istanbul. So he has a really nice life. And later on, when he looks at this retrospectively, he thinks that this was a period when the world was sucking him in, right? That the effects of that spiritual awakening in Kostroma starts to be felt less in his life. Now, he is still awakening. Things are still happening in his soul, right? But the world is distracting him to a large extent early on. But then he has another awakening. So this is awakening after awakening. One day, while shaving, looking at the mirror, he notices that there are white pieces of beard appearing in his beard, maybe hair too. And this reminds him of the reality of death, and that comes as a shock, right? So what's happening here? Now, he's not doing anything bad. We should emphasize he's a member of the House of the Wisdom of Islam, Dar al-Hikmat al-Islamiyya. Right? This is the highest institute of scholarship. He is being a scholar. He is serving the ummah. He's searching for solutions to the pressing problems of the empire. This is end of war. The Ottomans, of course, are defeated. They capitulate. The British occupy Istanbul. The war of resistance is starting all around Anatolia against invading Allied forces, plus the Greeks are now invading Anatolia. But Istanbul itself, the seat of power of the caliphate, is under occupation, and the British are acting quite insolently in the city, and Bediuzzaman Said Nursi is fighting against this insolence in Istanbul. He is writing treatises, he is writing articles, he is talking in order to preserve the morale and in order to respond to the insolent acts such as of the British, such as the Anglican Church comes to Istanbul and asks the scholars of Istanbul questions that are like challenging Islam. And this is a long tradition. The missionaries had a long tradition of studying the sources of Islam, investigating things, and then coming up with challenging questions. And there's a literature of refutations written against these missionary works. But now the British are coming from a position of power, and with that power behind them, the members of the Anglican Church are asking these insolent questions to scholars of the city. And many of those scholars are now writing treatises to respond to those questions. And Bediuzzaman Said Nursi writes a brief piece in which he says, we are going to respond to those insolent questions because they are insolent, not because they are questions, not because they are scholarly questions that need an answer, right? That's a separate issue, right? We are going to respond to those 6 questions with 6 spits. We are going to spit on their face 6 times in response to this. And then he also goes ahead and gives very brief answers to those questions, and brief but to the point answer to those questions. So he is doing his jihad continuing to do his jihad in Istanbul. He is serving the Ummah, serving in the way of God in Istanbul. But still, the comforts of the world bother him. He feels like this is not the real thing. The real thing is something beyond, right? All of this, all of what's happening here. This is not going to last. Even these tremendous transformations to the caliphate is, the seat of the caliphate is occupied. The Ottoman Empire is disintegrating. There is a resistance beginning against this. Even these will disappear. And what will be left will be one's heart and one's connection to God. So he wants to focus on that as all of these other things are going on, right? So yet the realization of the ephemeral nature of this fame, so he's famous, right? And the worldly blessings that accompany it. He is known by everybody, he's respected by everybody, he has a nice salary, he has a nice job, he has a nice company, he has a nice house, right? The ephemeral nature of this fame and the worldly blessings that accompany it, this realization of the frustration with all of this deepens in his inner crisis, in his awakening. And, by the way, because of his let's call it fight against the British, there was an order for him to be shot. Right? The British control Istanbul, and they pass an order for him to be shot. Wherever he's found, if British soldiers find him, they're going to shoot him. And there are a few occasions where he scrapes, with death as a result of this. So he rents a place outside of the then Istanbul. And he leaves his house in Çamlıca. He rents a place outside of Istanbul, and he again withdraws from society to some extent. And once again, he's in Halwa there. And there he ultimately comes out of this crisis process of awakening with spiritual assistance from Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, or Gailani, the giant of the Islamic tradition, whom we can consider to be at the font of all Sufi orders, right? Abdul Qadir Gailani and Imam Rabbani. Imam Rabbani is the 17th century. He is also called Mujaddid Alfi Sani, so he is also considered the Mujaddid of the second 1,000 years of Islam. Who lived in India, the Mughal Empire, and initiated a new branch in the Naqshbandi Sufi order. A very, very important figure. In this process, the spiritual assistance that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi receives from these two giants of the Islamic tradition is that he says Futuhul Ghaib by Abdul Qadir Jilani. He says he read that, but the content he describes fits Abdul Qadir Gailani's Fathul Rabbani, and this is probably because at the time when they printed books, they would print one book, and on the margins they would print another book. So he probably had a volume, the title of which was Futuhul Ghaib, but in the margins of that book, or in addition to Futuhul Ghaib, in that book, Fathul Rabbani was also included. So he's reading Fathul Rabbani, and he's reading Imam Rabbani's Maktubat in this period. And he says that Fathul Rabbani really operated on his soul because it exposes the deficiencies of the soul, the weaknesses of the soul, the appetites of the soul. It exposes them, and it scolds the reader for not properly acting to cleanse the soul, to cleanse the heart from all those. So that operates on his soul, and that becomes very painful. So he puts the book on the side and he reads Maktubat Rabbani, and that is like gentler, and that's takes his hand. Imam Rabbani is taking his hand and taking him through what we may understand as Bediuzzaman Said Nursi's suluk. And at the end, after a while, when that operation does what it did in terms of healing, he comes back to Fathur Rabbani. Now he reads it more easily. And long story made short, he comes to the end of his sluk. Bediuzzaman Said Nursi comes to a very powerful realization at the end of this process. This spiritual assistance guides him away from the weaknesses of his commanding soul, nafs, like evil commanding soul, for fame and its subtle tendency to seek solutions to worldly problems through worldly arrangements. This is important. Up to this point, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi is an Ustad Nursi is an activist. He is in the world. He's diagnosing the problems of the Muslim society. He is trying to come up with solutions to them, and those solutions are, taking this, putting from there, taking that, putting from there, putting here, arranging things within the world, right? Disposing things within the world. Those are the kinds of solutions that is coming up with up to this point, right? Now, is that wrong? No, it is perfectly fine. But he is now reaching an even higher level of realization. If you will, the maqam al-sidq, the station of veracity, where causes and effects lose their relevance, because you start to see that the works of the causer of all causes, you start to see the causes and the effects equally as the works of the causer of all causes. And from that station, from that place, one looks at the world with a different perspective, and starts to come up with solutions to the problems that one sees here in different ways, focusing on the soul, focusing on the root causes. Because whatever is happening in the world, right, beyond the material worldly causes that we can attribute to them, there is the will of the causer of all causes. And the causer of all causes disposes things in our service to the extent that we can come close to him, right? With our worship, with our extra worship, with our sincerity, to a point that, as he says in the Qur'an, right? He becomes our hand, he becomes our eyes, he becomes our ears. He becomes the power that is disposing the world before his slave. And at that point, the disposal of worldly things by our involvement becomes irrelevant, because we know that he is the one who is disposing, and we put our trust in him, and he disposes them off for us. Now, he disposes them for us. But, of course, there still is a nizam, there still is an order in the world. And that order exists because of his will, right? And we are charged with acting according to, right? According to that order, taking the means within the bounds of that order, right? But the actions are according to intentions. Taking those means by putting our trust in the means versus taking those means by putting our trust in God, and because those means are manifestations of the will of our Lord. Okay. Now, this is probably a deeper matter that may require a longer explanation, but in a nutshell, this is what's happening with Bediuzzaman Said Nursi. This spiritual assistance from Abdul Qadir Jilani and Imam Rabbani, and in the process, possibly Ali radiallahu anh, right? He doesn't articulate this as clearly as the others, but Ali radiallahu anh is coming into the picture. He began with Ahmed Hani, the 17th century saint, poet, Kurdish saint and poet, in his Uwaisi Connections. And if you don't understand what this term is, please listen to the previous episode of this recordings. Then Imam Ghazali, then Abdul Qadir Gailani and Imam Rabbani, and then most likely Imam Ali radiallahu anh. These are his spiritual guides in this process. This spiritual assistance guides Ustad Nursi away from the weaknesses of his commanding soul and its subtle tendency to seek solutions to worldly problems through worldly arrangements. With advice from Imam Rabbani, he resolves to concentrate all of his intellectual and spiritual effort on understanding the Qur'an and proclaiming its message. This is a ugly world that's emerging around him. The institutions that preserved religion and religiosity among Muslims in the Ummah for centuries are being demolished, disappearing, right? The caliphate is in the process of disappearing. It's not abolished yet. That's going to happen in 1924. But it's lost its functionality, right? Madrasas, the Sufi orders, everything is crumbling apart. The entire Muslim world is being colonized. Even the seat of power of the caliphate is lost to the European powers. And beyond the physical force of this colonization, the secular worldview and practices, the secularity of Europe is now being imported, forced in and volitionally imported to the lands of Islam. So this is a period of tremendous crisis, unlike any period in the history of Islam before. Even the Mongol invasions of 1256, right? In terms, if you look at how widespread those invasions were, it did not affect the entire world of Islam. And where it affected, it was not as pervasive as what we can call European modernity. So this is a time of crisis unlike any time in the history of Islam. We need solutions unlike any that have been produced before in response to problems. Perhaps with the exception of the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when he came to the Asr Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, right? In terms of quantity at a smaller scale, but in terms of quiddity, what's happening, it's similar. So, with advice from Imam Rabbani, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi resolves to concentrate all of his intellectual and spiritual efforts on understanding the Qur'an and proclaiming its message. If there will be a solution to the dire problems of this troubled age, those solutions will come from the Qur'an, because that is the source. The Qur'an and the Sunnah, of course, as the first interpretation of the Qur'an, and the Qur'an being put into practice, right? So he focuses his entire attention on the Qur'an. He develops this really deep and intimate relationship with the Qur'an, and from there on, the solutions that he is going to produce, the insights that he is going to develop, the inspirations that he is going to receive, right? For all of them, the source is the Qur'an, the Sunnah, and those works of earlier giants of the tradition that have been inspired by the Qur'an, that are like windows to look at the Qur'an, not works that Bediuzzaman Said Nursi is going to read and interact for their own sake, but works that he is going to read, study, understand, interact as instruments to look at the Qur'an. So in the past episode, for instance, I mentioned this book of prayers and litanies and ahzab and so on and so forth, Majmu'at al-Ahzab, right? It's a collection of the gist of the teachings of the giants of Islam. He's going to, keep that on his side, right? But at the center and permanently, now we have the Qur'an. He becomes, in a sense, a translator of the message of the Qur'an for the age that we live in. So inshallah, we'll stop here. And mashallah, Bediuzzaman Said Nursi was an ocean, and the more we dip into the ocean, the more comes. It's difficult to finish this in a brief time, but I see that it's already past an hour. Inshallah, we will stop here and continue this in the following episode. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. الفاتحة. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. الحمد لله رب العالمين.